Hello, first of all. El President Mesa is not only recognized by his political activity, he was the founder and director of the Bolivian Cinemateca, and he's a well-known journalist in radio, TV, and in print, and he has received several awards in his during his career. He works trying to strengthen the democratic and human rights institutions. He has written uh, several books. He's has also been the president. He was taken the responsibility of the Bolivian court that represents Bolivia before its conflict with Chile. It has achieved many things, and it's great. We're very proud to have President Mesa to be able to open up our series of post neoliberalism in Latin America. Thank you very much for this invitation to the university, first of all, to all the professors, Ferraro and Felletti in particular, who had the idea that I could share with you on this moment. And I would like to be able to share, based on my reflection on Latin America, open some debate with you regarding the situation that Latin America is living at the moment. I will start uh, asking with in regards as to whether we're talking about one or several Latin Americas. Are we talking about political, social, and economical context that is equivalent all throughout the region, which is made up of 20 countries, or if we are talking about specific realities and different according to certain specific circumstances that the region faces at this moment? Second of all, the question regarding with whether what we're living is a stage that can be defined as post-neoliberal, or if there are some lines, guidelines along the management of our countries that still keep some of the elements that we still define as neoliberalism tied within the concept that is defined with Washington at the current moment. And third is to deal with what are the different perspectives in the future based on this reality in the region from now on. From a general perspective, and if we were to compare Latin America with other regions of the world, it's very difficult to find a geographical space with so many common elements. It's the things are related with history, with culture, with the language, with the religion. All these aspects defined from Mexico to Argentina, if we were to look from the outside, a whole common criteria, a series of different aspects that bring us together much more than the ones that draw us apart. And this is if we compare with Asia or Africa or Europe. And there we could recognize if the picture is a picture taken from far away, where we're looking at one Latin America, except for the case of Haiti that speaks French and Brazil speaking Portuguese, all the rest speak Spanish, and with a dominant religion, which is a Catholic religion, even though there's a great growth of all the other Christian religions. and we have a past in common in terms of the pre-Hispanic area or Portuguese and in terms of the colonial past. It is very interesting. The last question, could we, in that sense, that Latin America is not part of the West, or maybe on the contrary, that after 300 of years of colonial periods and some others Republican periods with other domains, we could understand Latin America as a region with a very strong Western influence that has an arm of Indian origin and another one with Western influence. Uh, we were talking about language and religion. And if it is true that Latin America has hundreds of languages and different conceptions of what Christianism was, and before Christianism was imposed, the concepts that unify Latin America is the language, Spanish, Portuguese, and to some degree French, but for the most part Spanish, and the languages that are from the Ibero continent. 75% of the Latin American population has uh, uh, Latin origin and a religious origin. So that determines how we are tied to the Western world. But if we were to be precise regarding the characteristics of development of the last 12, 25, or 20 years in the region, it is with no doubt that there is a context of economical context, most of all, that determines different developments and different challenges and different areas of influence between North America, and I'm referring to Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and South America. There are some things that cannot be ignored. It is clear that the relationship between Mexico and the United States and the participation of Mexico in the NAFTA market um, do show a different relation that is very different as opposed to the relationship that maybe Brazil could have, which is another very strong power player in the relationship with the United States. If you look the area of influence in Mexico, its area of influence is Central America and the Caribbean. The Mexican economy has grown a great deal in relation to the cooperation that it has with the United States, whereas Brazil has grown in a more diversified way. The interchange in Brazil is a lot bigger in terms of commercial partners as compared to Mexico. That doesn't mean that Brazil has a different economic or technological dynamic that would be greater. What that means is that Mexico has been able to achieve, through its relationship with the United States, very important results in terms of industrial advancement and growth of its exports. It is clear that Central America has in its composition, in its productive composition, some difficulties because it is not a region that is so rich in terms of materia prima, materia prima, um, basic inputs. Now we have a great we have a great deal of wealth in terms of mineral richness in Brazil. So the growth from the economical growth in Central America in the last years has been less intense and less fast, less rapid than the one that has been experienced by South America. Within that constant, the relationship between Central America and the U.S. is much more sensitive than the one between South America and the United States. There are issues like migration that have different characteristics, and it is highly sensitive for Central America and the North American portion, and it is not so important to the South American. So the migration in South America is different. There is a lot more immigration towards Europe or within the same countries in the southern continent, um, as compared to Central America, where the migration is almost in its entirety focused on migration towards the United States. And that marks decidedly the political approach of the U.S. Towards these countries. So one of the complicated issues is as a key issue for the country. We have a dominant presence of the United States on Latin America that is much more present and evident in North America and Central America than in the South America. In some cases, it is drastically different. We have the case of Venezuela and Bolivia. In a smaller scale, Ecuador. In other cases, the relationships have little to do with the logic of this ties within the Monroe Doctrine, the military presence in Central America and the Caribbean, or the direct influence of the United States in the region, especially in the Andean region, had to do specifically with the fight against drug trafficking. I do these sort of references in a very quick, very brief, so that you understand when I speak about different contexts and different fragments of one region that apparently has some common elements, but has also different characteristics that have to be taken into account. The second aspect, the birth of globalization, that starts to be defined much more clearly in the second half of the 90s, and today it's a reality that is known totally unquestioned. It is completely identified with the concept of the development of neoliberal policies. This has to do with the fact that there was a coincidence of the great growth due to reasons of international commerce and development technologically wise. Then we had the virtual economies, we had the domain of the internet that was coming from the illusion, hand in hand with the illusion that there was democracy and there was a market economy that was being explained as neoliberal. The economic currents change according to the different moments in history. The historic current have a different character. There is a nature of growth and some economic depression, and there are some moments of expansion of free market, expansion of state planning. It's not a determinate line. In other words, it's not a one and only line that leads us to generalized one way of economic development. There are different steps during the growth in the society, in the transformation of society, that we can consider irreversible. And globalization is a fact that is irreversible because it represents a transformation process from several angles. This reality, the globalization, came here to stay, and it is not very likely that we will go back to a world that is less connected or living without the aspects that define globalization. Within this context, globalization generates the imposition of some rules within the economic environment. The transition from China to from into an open economy, practically capitalist, is a good example of this, and that implies or makes us presume that the rules of the international market will be determined according to the rules of the opening, but that opening does not imply necessarily that from the internal point of view of the economy of a country, we cannot think of greater presence of the state or an entrepreneurial state from with stages of planification looking for development as long as these internal processes are compatible, and there is no reason to think that it could not be together with the insertion of a globalized market. So I would not tie this as an indissoluble marriage between market globalization and neoliberalism. It is perfectly possible to be within globalization, not be isolated, but also define some of the proper spaces within the economy of each country, within those margins which are of course, some of the elements are worth mentioning in the cases of Latin America. Within that reality, we are in a Latin America that is post neoliberal. And the answer to that question is yes. And why? Because during the 90s, there was a dominant approach towards the structural reforms in the monetary arena, reduction of the state, an orientation towards privatization, the search for higher efficiencies, understanding that efficiency was coming hand in hand with the reduction of state and privatization, and also looking into full insertion into the economy of the international markets. And all these trends were accompanied by an orthodox and dogmatic approach where there was a need to do a radical turn in a pendulum that were replying to a recipe, if we can call it that way, uh, applying to the recipe like within the Washington Consensus, where there were some requisites that needed to be complied with. Most of these countries applied this recipe, and some of them did apply it in a very proximate economical orthodoxy, coming very close to what we define as neoliberalism. This process incorporated, and we can also see this in some of the policies of the World Bank, the logic that we could not think of development without facing the fight against poverty, not just for moral reasons, but for practical reasons also. It was an economic convenient thing that needed to be addressed with, and there was a dominant tendency towards facing the challenges, the social challenges within the continent, and they refer to the imperative aspect that the fight against poverty and fight against the inequality were two necessary elements within the region and that they needed to be turned into priority elements to be taken into account. And that's when we looked to question as to whether higher wealth was the way to fight against poverty or whether we could fight, we would question also if expansion through market regulations would generate the results that were expected in the social and economic environment. So this century made us face some economic adjustments that had brought the equilibrium to the macroeconomic system that had been given long-term stability to the economies, but had not generated the results that we expected in terms of social improvements, in terms of higher acquisition power, better employment, better quality of employment, and lowering the indexes of poverty. The efforts and the different adjustments that we have been forced to do in Latin America did not produce the results that we expected, and that is expressed in the turn in the region towards some other positions that can be defined as leftist and populist. In 1998, the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and with its progressive turn towards other governments from center, left, social democratic, or socialist, it's very difficult to characterize this. So the term left or right is not enough to explain ideologically what's happening nowadays in Latin America, as opposed to the idea from left and right that we had during the Cold War era. In the time of the Marxism era that was clearly depicting a polarized world. There is polarization today, but it is not so easily explained today based on a left being socialist or the right being capitalist. But to this day, we still use these terms to try to understand each other. The These new leaderships as they searched, they established a new map in Latin America that was clearly different. And now, then, we're talking about more than one Latin America that broke with the uniformity of the democratic countries of Latin America. The process of application of structural reforms in the 90s made us post in the region that together with the representative democracy came the market economy. And that idea changes and is transformed. And then what we find is different trials that accept the democratic government that we had inherited, this democracy that we instituted in the 80s. And then we try to postulate different political and economical postulates that implied a different setup, where we had a basic democracy with the possibility to apply different schemes in the political and social scheme. We can write three lines: the countries of the ALBA, which is Venezuela as a leader, and it exists as and President Chavez had defined it. It's very rhetorical, but it helps us understand it as the socialism of the 21st century. Then we had the other countries that were called to the concept, to the classical of the European social democracy. These are countries like Chile and Brazil and Uruguay, with leftist presidencies without breaking with the structure, with the traditional structure, having economical handling that could have also an effect on the countries that are socialist. And now I'm talking about the countries that had a very specific emphasis in social investment, in the need to focus and to fight that is aggressive against poverty without breaking down with the economic scheme that had been inherited. And then we have the last group of countries that maintained very clearly the master lines of what nowadays we understand as neoliberal. We're talking about Mexico, mainly most of the Central American countries, countries like Colombia. We had President Uribe with a very strong leadership, and then Paraguay and Peru. So what we're talking about the concept of neoliberalism were not changed in its whole within the 20 countries of Latin America. There were some countries that dealt within an orbit that kept the dominant liberal policies. What actually changed fundamentally was the end of the orthodox liberal rhetoric. So they came to understanding that it needed to be there was a need for flexibility, and there are some points are important inherited from the 90s. What we were talking about the deficit, it was not enough to have an effort to direct public investment into social, health, education to improve the situation. But except some exceptions, and the exceptions are the confirmation that there were some mistakes in not applying it. From 1990 and this decade that was neoliberal, the understanding came to be that the macroeconomic responsibility, that the fundamental indicators of the economics of a country and the proper management of its currency were needed for the economic and political stability. So, management in a responsible way of the macroeconomy was not a neoliberal attitude. It was necessary to develop any of the countries to the left, to the right, or to the center. And this was one of the lessons that was adopted by most of the countries in Latin America that explain why some of the countries that have joined the socialism of the 21st century have had some success in their political processes and some others have failed. It is evident that those countries that have tried to break this logic of responsible management of the economy has to deal with some issues. And it is evident in Venezuela, and in a way, Argentina is starting to face that same conflict. Uh, Countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, that independently of the radical discourse, has been managing the macro economy very seriously and very rigorously in what we would define as neoliberal austere policies, but they're not understood like that. I will talk to you about some macroeconomic information.
If we follow the logic of what is happening at the beginning of the 21st century, we would think that Latin America tends to carry its political pendulum towards the left. And the nature of the Latin American president is more towards the center than the left and to the right, and that the future of Latin America is going to be to go towards the left within a certain model that represents determining countries that are more on the showcase of the international showing. So probably what we're looking at is a different reality from that logic of the left pendulum that comes from the present towards the future. I finished this part so I can specifically speak about the future, highlighting that those nations that represent positions that are more radicalized, more towards the left, more socialist, they are being supported in a very in inversion in social inversion and a very important logic against the fight against poverty in a policy of working of racism of discrimination and in a redistribution very important social redistribution but at no time even in those countries where the state has become a more important role that they're behaving or nor directly, not even remotely towards a socialist path. So nothing that is happening in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, or Argentina has nothing to do with the Cuban proposal of 1959, nothing to do with the communism of the Soviet Union. If you analyze the mechanism, the internal mechanism of the development of private property, of the mechanism, the production systems, individual and collective, the mechanism of the commerce and the exchange. It is it is involved with restrictions or transformations that have changed the system of property, whether individual or collective, or they have changed the system of production fundamentally. So the idea of socialism, such as the Soviet Union or as Cuba, has disappeared. Quite the contrary, Cuba, who's going through like a very large crisis, is trying to go backwards. They're trying to go and regain again the private initiative, and it's transforming its economy into an economy that's more open internally, independently from what they share and about their political logic. So, consequently, it's a premise that is a key. At no time, not even at the more radical time that the countries of the ALBA were there, we have never been near nor far, not even nearly close or no towards a path of socialism. The tendency towards state politics, such as like nationalizations, has been relatively less in our countries. Maybe the country more nationalizing has been Bolivia. Bolivia has put forward a process of nationalizing, quite important. It has done more than a dozen of enterprises have been nationalized, with the exception of oil, which is the only thing that oil hasn't been nationalized. And then that tends to be the great nationalization of Evo Morales. But we really didn't have a nationalization. I'm not going to go into details about this, but simply I'm going to illustrate to show you if there has been like some nationalization in Argentina, Venezuela, and Ecuador. But the logic of nationalizations hasn't been a logic that has been dominant. In the case of Brazil, Brazil that has a process of privatization very important of the president Enrique Cardoso. It wasn't reversed by President Lula, and it was not by Dilma Rousseff as well. So you have an idea. So where's the emphasis? The emphasis was in the nature of the speech, and in the correct recuperation that we have to finish the talk that the state has nothing to do with the economy and the politics of a country. The state has a fundamental point, not as a regulator, which was the great illusion of the neoliberal time. The state has to regulate the economy, has to create institutions that are going to allow to administer appropriately what the privates are doing and call their attention, because that was a very subsidiary secondary role. Instead it is like a role, a fundamental of initiative in education, in health, and in the logic of the planification to redistribute adequately in the, the gains of the country. That happened in some countries. Colombia, Mexico, Peru, as I mentioned, did not mark this line. But all of the countries in Latin America, to give you a specific example, apply that concept of that we know it as that we know it technically as conditional transferences, or if I can explain it better, like bonuses. A bonus of health, a bonus of education, a bonus of elderly. The idea of the bonuses, which is understood as a populist formula to gain people who would vote for you, and that actually developed interesting results. The family bag in Brazil allowed that 40 million people would go through. That was a mechanism that would go from the poor status towards the middle class, not just with a bonus. That monthly, I'm going to give you a certain amount of you. In the case of Bolivia, there are three basic bonuses. One, or I'm going to mention two. One is the health for kids and mothers, and then education. The bonus of the mothers for kids, it is something that gives given to the mothers monthly, as long as the mothers are going to show their visits to the doctors once before they go to do their checkups before the birth to see that they were dealt with, and then they're going to show also the vaccinations during the first year of education. So I'm going to give you something as long as you give me something back. And then I'm going to guarantee as a state with a certain amount of money that that very poor person is very important, that that woman and kids are going to be adequately taken care of. In the case of education and mentally, I'm going to give you a certain amount of money as long as you are going to show me that your child is going to school. If your child stops going to school, I stop giving you this voucher, which gives me giving that universal education. Those vouchers that we're giving Most of the countries did this independently, whether they were left or they were from the right. Colombia gave it, and Bolivia gave it too. Mexico gave it, as well as Brazil. El Salvador, as well as Chile. In what sense do I mention this? In the sense that the conscience that we had to generate social policies from the state in a specific direction, it was very important. In what measure was that accompanied by structural and inversion, or invest in public life? And there were some states that gave more structure, more funds, which was a transformation in the social aspect than other countries. This scenario, in the case of countries of the socialists of the 21st centuries, came together with that ingredient, which is the most polemic of all, the ingredient of the populism, that is with the person of a one great leader. This person becoming some sort of god, and the construction of the idea that the process that this person, what do you call it, revolution or transformation, is not possible and it can't be understood without that leadership. That implies two consequences that are very clear. One is like an authoritarian logic. Presidents were very authoritarian within a structure that it was democratic. They concentrated all the powers, and then they ended up manipulating the society in one specific direction. This would not have been possible if they didn't count with something basic, which is the legitimacy of origin. Those presidents were able to remain in power because they were able to contrast their power with the popular vote. That was the important difference of the leadership, of popular leaderships from the past. I mean, that here we had a push for the vote every 4 or 5 years, and the successful results, at least the ones that would come up, they generated a reproduction of the vote. If it has like a curve that is decreasing, it wasn't as much until it was be able to put in play a discussion if there was like a fraudulent election. In the case of Venezuela, what would have happened if Chavez would have been alive? He could have maintained an overwhelming win over the opposition, or maybe he would have been lost the polemic election of President Maduro. And what would be going on today in Venezuela if they were to go vote today? Would Maduro get a percentage of votes to win the oppositions? Those are questions that are still up in the air. But in the more polemic time, like let's say Maduro against Capriles, we could talk about a country or a leader who inherited a country on half with this support after 14 years of government, which there means that there will be a result about our opinions if this result answers to genuine gains, or quite the contrary, it was covering a chaotic situation. In the situation of Ecuador, President Correa has won with quite comfort in the last elections, and it's quite possible that President Morales is going to be quite comfortable in the next elections, which are going to be taking place next October 12th. That line that has to deal with the strong personalizations, the cult of personality, it is something that, from my perspective, that I question. The destruction or weakening of the democratic institutions. It's very difficult to be compatible to have a authoritarian government with with organizations that are going to project towards the future. But it tells us if the democracy represents is enough. In the negative, it is very clear that the destruction of the institutions or its weakenings weakens democracy itself. But it also suggests that if we're not at the crisis moment of the democratic model, not in the essential way, not in the philosophy, not in what I believe, and not the Republican, which I believe firmly, but also like countries like United States and the European countries today, it is very clear that there is a lacking of the answer that the democratic government and the democratic leaders are giving to society. Movements such as the Indignados, the process of showing of new leaderships, for example, in Spain against parties, or what is going on in in France with the extreme right, or in Greece, as allow us to ask whether we have to remodel not the philosophical idea of democracy, but maybe some mechanisms of representation. In what measure in Latin America is the representation of the democracy concentrated in the Congress is genuine? And how can we tie up society and the government that does not go through the representative democracy? That means that we have to go towards a democracy that's more participative, democracy that participates more. That is not something that we're going to cover that with fascism, but there are mechanisms that allow the expression of democracy, and those are answers that are still pending. At any rate, this was a very important factor that we had to take into consideration. And I wrap up in this part so that I can go on my last part saying this. Latin America has lived between 2000, towards the end of 2004 to 2005 till now, 2014, 10 years uninterrupted of a spectacular gain, economic gain. I mean, the whole idea that we have a transformation between neoliberalism towards positions, let's just call them progressive, with an social emphasis and with results that are very important of fights against poverty. And as we know in Latin America, probably you heard this 1,000 times, it is the continent that is the less equal in the world. So it couldn't explain itself like how this country could be right or left, Democrat, social, or Marxist. It is explained, in an essence, because of the economic boom. The economic boom that was never lived before. I'm not talking about 3 decades ago. At the beginning of the year of the 70s, we lived a similar scenario, with the exception of the crisis of oil that Europe and the United States lived. But the raw materials did yield something. We can't really compare that. Never, never in their history, never in the history of Latin America has had a boom, economic boom, that it was such amazing and so sustained and as long as that one as we have lived now. If we take the component of the economic boom to what I'm referring now, probably many Latin American governments would not have been able to survive the length of time that they had, and nor would they have the success that they had. This does not mean that there is no merit on many of those governments, and that the actions of those governments have yielded important results. I mean, it means that without this component, the redistribution would not have been possible. In these past 10 years, Latin America has achieved the best indicators against poverty in their history. But they are so high, the positive results in reducing poverty in Colombia and Peru, as well as in Bolivia and Ecuador. What do I mean by this? That it's not the political model, but it's the economic reality. That is the good administration of that economic reality. Peru, which has been in the policies of privatization that open up the economy and allow investments from the outside, was able to achieve. Bolivia, with a state policy, with some control, legal control, and with a control from the state of the economy, achieve extraordinary results against fight against poverty. This means that we fight better against poverty of Evo Morales compared to Toledo in Peru or Garcia Numala? No, it means that the key is in the better prices, in the logic of social inversion, and your behavior of political and government. And it has to deal with an uniformity in social policies as a product of an international, which I did not mention. For example, is the World Bank. Where are we and where are we going? Today, in about a month, the beginning of November, we will know what happened in Bolivia, what happened in Uruguay, and what happened in Brazil. The most important election of them all is the election in Brazil. In the election in Brazil, as we all know, and very unexpected, we never had to discard the luck of someone dying, that Campos' death changed the election and seriously put in danger the re-election of Irma Rousseff. The candidate from the opposition, who all of a sudden comes up as the replacement of Campos, Marina, now is pretty much tied with Guillermo Rousseff. It could be that the next October 5th, Pete could win the elections and the global scenario of South America and Latin America in general would not really suffer in big changes. But it could be that Marina Silva could win, which could bring a big question. What is Marina Silva looking at the ideological point? Is she a left woman? Is she in the middle? Is she to the right? Maybe she's a whole lot of things all at once. Marina Silva, regarding the environment, she's quite a progressive. She broke from President Lula regarding the when she was in charge of the environment. She's quite a conservator, for example, gays and abortion, because she was brought up in a more Christian way. She is unpredictable in the sense that what she would do with economic monsters such as Petrobras, which is currently is going through a big crisis due to corruption charges. That is a question. Why don't we have as to what kind of political decision Marina would have? It's not that or the other one. She's not with Enrique Cardoso or Lula, so consequently, it brings up serious questions. Probably in internal terms, there are going to be important changes in some aspects of her development. But the question is, how will Marina Silva work in Latin America? Should her win take place related to Venezuela and the ALBA countries? Is she going to be closer or more separated to the policies of the United States? Is it going to be more flexible or less interest in turning the organisms that want to get involved, such as like UNASUR or CELAC? These are very hard answers. And if Pete wins or Marina Silva wins, Brazil is not going to go more towards the left from where it already is. And we suppose left in the economic sense, right? And we suppose that Brazil is characterized as a country that is a social left democrat in Latin America. But this supposition makes the biggest difference as to what was going on with Dilma and Campos. If Campos was a candidate, it would have been that Dilma would have won, and Dilma could probably still win. But it's very difficult to find a clear answer in there. At no point it seems that Brazil is going to go towards the direction that Chavez went in 1998. In Uruguay, we have a big question too. It's quite possible that Tabaré Vázquez wins, which is of Frente Amplio, but the young candidate, Callepo, who comes from the right and who comes from a classic party, which is conservative, that could win. If in Uruguay the right wins, it's quite evident that there would be what we would call that militants of Alba would say that we're regressing. Is Mujica a president of the radical left? Certainly not. President Mujica from Frente Amplio has taken measures very interesting, such as marijuana or abortion, but economically he's quite moderate, and he is a very rational man and a very great wisdom. So even in the hypothesis of the win of Frente Amplio, should they win, they are not moving towards socialism. They are moving towards the guarantee of a structure of stability in the policies and government of Uruguay. Now, what happens in Bolivia? Most probable, it's likely that Evo Morales is going to win, the president, who is a very radical way of being, that he has a line that he likes to stay with the state rhetoric, and I think that I think that it could be a third government. It could be like a more pragmatic government, and it would be closer to a development, let's say, less radicalized, since the country is has pretty much declared under state all the companies that were already in the country. So he's trying to open up a more important space, to open up a more wants to open up a space for investment from the outside.
But
Peru will change with a new government. Humala was not part of the ALBA. President Bachelet from Chile is recovering. She's recovering from a more left than when she was the president for the first time. But this is from a social democracy that is more rational. She is not in line of great states or going towards the left, the way that Chavez would do it. Colombia has gone from a extreme right with President Uribe, has on President Santos, who's starting his mandate, has a very economical line, liberal, very progressive, that probably is going to take Colombia towards a process of peace. President Santos is a pragmatic man in political, um, outside policies, and he is different from President Uribe, who was one more confrontational. President Peña Nieto, he is moving towards liberal reforms, open up Pemex towards an outside inversion, an educational reform, modernizing in the sense that we have to modernize during the 90s, and an economic development that is not going to move an inch towards the opening of the markets. In the Central American countries, if we're going to talk about the left, we could think about El Salvador with a president from FMLN who is not someone who can be compared towards the left of President Correa. And any of the other presidents from Central America or the other governments, there are governments that are very liberal in their tendencies, with the exception of Nicaragua. Nicaragua, nevertheless, and President Ortega maintain a relationship quite positive with the United States, more than what is already spoken. So, the future of Latin America is not a future towards the left. I think that the experience of the socialism in the 21st century showed everything that it had to do, and that in general terms, we're not going to deepen the authoritarian populist caudalism. Instead, we're going to maintain that leadership in some cases, and sometimes that leadership is going to weaken progressively. But I don't really see that the democratic scenario is going to suffer dramatic transformations in towards a radical, neither to the left or to the right. I think that I think that there's some additions towards the center, and so we're not going to talk about the other quantity of countries that are right to the right of the spectrum.
I finish saying that there are two different questions that are difficult to answer in Venezuela's case and Argentina's case. Venezuela is in a different way. It is facing a collapse from economic point of view, and it's a very difficult political situation to resolve. Can they really resolve a political resolution without having elections and the way where the country is highly polarized when we have questions between the about the continuity of President Maduro that cannot be answered with unless the government party can answer, and they're dealing with the chance of destabilization that could lead to high violence. So Venezuela was a key country in transformation, and it would lead to a crisis, but it can still plays a high influence in the region. The next question is Argentina. Can Argentina resolve a crisis that is not as strong as the one in Venezuela, but that it's still looking towards facing problems? Mrs. Kirchner cannot re-elect herself, so she would look for a puppeteer to We don't know if he will continue with the Kirchner philosophy, and it could happen that even a candidate supporting Kirchner, the logic could go to a position in the Senate to try and resolve some of the problems in the economic and structural issues. This is the end of the story in regards to integration. Latin America requires integration processes. It has many mechanisms of integration organisms, CENAC, OEA, the Central America Communica CARICOM, and many, many, many more. It's a very dispersed and contradictory alley with very little internal force that can really unite. Within this context, the integration is a challenge that is pending, and it has been very difficult due to the idealization. The ideology has not been open for a dialogue, and the fact that you are from the left, the right, or the center does not mean that we cannot talk for economic issues that are important. The economic boom is coming to an end. We're not going to go into a recession that will collapse, but we will not continue on this boom. Some indicators are already showing this. So we need to ask ourselves if we will be able to survive in conditions that are not as positive in the future. I am an optimist. All these Latin Americans in plural are diverse, and they're less radicalized than what the scenario allows us to read into. Whoever reads Latin America, it goes and it starts within uh, Chavez, not by Uribe or Santos or Bachelet. So we have Chavez, Correa, and Morales are Latin America. They are a very important part of Latin America, but they're not the whole of it. Latin America is not a continent of socialism of the 21st century. We are in a situation of socialism leading to the left, but they're not radical. We are not in a Latin America that is post neoliberal, but we're starting to ask ourselves if we should not start going around and wander through Latin America post neoliberal of the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Mesa, for this very instructive and very detailed description of a very complex situation in Latin America. We all have learned a lot with this presentation. Now I'm going to open this forum for questions. And I have three questions, and then the President Mesa can answer. Are there any questions? Please. The microphone is not working. The interpreter cannot interpret. The microphone is not working. Él debe hablar inglés. I wanted to ask in regards to the role of the drug trafficking way in Latin America, especially. It is very different due to its gravity in Central America and South America. But I want to know what you think about the role of violence and the strategies that are being used and the uh, economical development in the region. And also, another question that I have is what do you think that is the role of the United States on the institutions, the international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in regards to economical development, specifically speaking in regards to Bolivia, uh, with what happened in Cochabamba with the water. Thank you. Good afternoon. And excuse me, I speak Spanish. It's my third language, so I look like a gringo. You didn't mention anything about Mercosur, so I would like to ask you, what do you think about Mercosur? Is it important for South America, for example? Yes and no. Is it important? You posed a question in regards to the possibilities of unification of criteria through integration ways with the motto of the European Union in Latin America. I have no doubt whatsoever, and I think that's a general vision. It's difficult to apply, but the way for economic integration, it's necessary, it's imperative to be able to attain that Latin America reaches better internal results, increasing its exchange, commercial and economical exchange within the region, and also being a more efficient interlocutor for the other regions in other markets like the Asian market and the European market. In some sense, I think that there are some attempts of economic integration, like the Pacific Alliance between Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, to be able to make liaisons that are more efficient towards Asia. And I'll talk to Mercosur in a moment. But you make a very important question regarding economic integration, with the objective being food for all Latin American. And then we have to make a combination of all the different efforts of economical interest, of productive character, nature, to be able to attain dividends so that everyone is able to eat in Latin America. And I have no doubt absolutely that one integration process of economical nature is the one that you are questioning.
Regarding the drugs and the multilateral issues and the role of the United States, without a doubt, 40 years of war on drugs, established by the United States with a logic of, with the United States interests, then in some chances try to reply to interests of Latin America. It has been a failure. The war on drugs has been a failure, and it needs to change. And it's time to start asking fundamental questions. I don't think that anymore can maintain. And we presented this on the last meeting in Cartagena, Colombia, that we need to have a debate about whether we're going to agree with drugs need to be taken to the courts, and it has to be a relation between the United States, Europe, and Latin America, because the consequences of narco traffic or drug trafficking are quite devastating. This happened during the 1980s, and now in Central America and Mexico, the effect of the violence and of the mafia is brutal. I could actually say that in Central America, the mafias are more powerful than the states, and consequently, We have to work into a path of integration so we can fight against drugs and the increase of violence, because now the states by themselves are not able to provide a good answer to that challenge. Something that is happening is that the security of the citizens is disappearing. The first issue in Latin America is the lack of security of the citizens. Latin America, by definition, and with a lot of, it is actually the continent that is the more pacifist. It has nothing internal militarily as it's happening in all other regions. But being a continent of peace, it is the most violent in the world. The city most violent in the world regarding like deaths of 100,000 is San Pedro Sula in Honduras. And there are five or six cities in Central America and 10 and 12 cities of Latin America that are in the 20 most violent in the world, which means that the topic is quite important. The topic that is related to drugs and all the consequences that it brings. And that's why my impression, for example, is that, yeah, if California were to gain a win of legalization of marijuana, the United States would begin to change its reasoning as a government as to what it has to do with drugs around the world. But I think that what we've done up to now hasn't worked and we have to change it. United States and the multilateral, the economic boom has allowed Latin America to have a more efficient answer against with the United States. Today, United States has less control in Latin America as before, even though there are some Central American countries that where the word of the United States is still domineering. The other organisms would define the economy of our country. IMF or the World Bank would establish lines of policies that we have to meet. Today, the World Bank is more associated with projects against fights against poverty than more than 20 or 30 years ago. And the IMF has more problems with the fiscal deficit of Spain or United States than the fiscal deficit of Bolivia or Ecuador. Mercosur. Mercosur is a big question. It is in a crisis process, much less than the Andean countries. The Andean countries pretty much has not there anymore. It made a very important role. It is the unity of Venezuela, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia. For Bolivia, Comunidad Andina was extraordinary, but now it doesn't meet that role anymore. Mercosur has difficulties because it's facing two realities, especially the Brazilian. Brazil is a country quite protectionist. It has a country that is less given to its own its own market. It has issues. It has serious issues in the issue with the vehicles. With Argentina, it's quite a confrontation. Paraguay and Uruguay are partners very small, and the insertion of Bolivia into Mercosur could change the scenario. But probably we have to think about the measures of third generations or fourth generation, which are not starting from point zero, or it's just like the freedom of presenting your new markets. And finally, I say this about Mercosur. Mercosur has the biggest issue that it has is ideologized. The issue is that the ideologic dominant is about the economic rationale, and that is not a very good element. There's time for three more brief questions. Good afternoon, President. My name is Claudia Matute. I'm from Chile. My question is, you highlighted that, or you qualified, three countries as neoliberal, which would be Mexico, Colombia, and Paraguay, if I recall. No, Peru, and Peru. My question is, we said that Chile was one of the experiments, you want to call it, more raw, of neoliberalism in Latin America from the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet and about the policies that was left behind, that was left up until now. Besides, well, basically, because of that, my question is, in your opinion, why is it that Chile currently is not a country that you would qualify as neoliberal? Good afternoon, President. I'd like to ask you a question about up to what point would you consider that Latin America could go into a face post socialism? I am a citizen from Ecuador, and I'd like to ask this question in the sense that now that Hugo Chavez is out of the equation, would you consider that a person like such as Rafael Correa and a government that has, has complaints about freedom of expression and has presented a quite strong, um, do you think that can carry on as to what Hugo Chavez left may continue to provoke that Latin America is going to turn into a society more polarized and by that more violent? Good afternoon. My question was about the integration, and what is your vision for the integration of the economic resources and economic and with the original populations given Latin America, such as like issues in Paraguay, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and how, in which sense, is this integration or your speech on this, includes these people? Oh, one more. Okay, perfect. Sorry. Sorry for being the last. I'd like to congratulate for your great and very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy to be able to listen to this in Spanish, and I think that that is a great push for the non-Spanish speakers that are going to learn how to speak Spanish, so be able to listen smart things in Spanish because we do speak smart in Spanish too. And also would like to give a little more detail about these vouchers. About your speech, I thought that it was very. I think that I understood that you think that it's a good mechanism, the use of or the implementation of these vouchers, so we can reduce so we can fight against poverty. Nevertheless, I like to present, at least from my analysis, that precisely these vouchers are ways to show that the democracy, the way it is done in our countries, and that is why do we think that I think this is how we validate that this is the democracy because I think through those vouchers I think also it shows the presidents that are remain in power or that they want to remain in power. Thank you.
Okay, it is unquestionable that Pinochet's Chile was neoliberal. But I really think that Chile of Elwin, Frey, Lagos, Bachelet, I'm not going to mention President Piñera, the one of consultation, cannot really be defined as neoliberal. That was a Chile that was where there was a possibility of a modernization process. There was a slight line of a policy that was radically liberal from Pinochet without breaking out with globalization. Chile is a very particular example of a position that is different from the other Latin American countries, where Chile maintained a progressist discourse and had a tremendous amount of advances, but it chose the way of the bilateral free trade agreements. It doesn't make part of Mercosur, and it developed more than 70 accords that are agreements of free trade, whereas the discourse of the Latin American countries, especially Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, was totally opposite to the free trade agreements. I would say that Chile, the one of the consultation, except for the President Piñera years, can be qualified as social democrat. And President Bachelet is really banking on some leftist positions with the constitutional reform and the attitude towards privatization of the educational system as perceived by some of the groups in the Chilean economy. So I don't think Chile should be considered as a neoliberal country. In regards as to whether we are living a stage that is post socialism of the 21st century, we are in a transition moment, and I think that we're living a stage that is going to last several years, that somehow is the one that delineates the stop of the line towards the path towards the socialism of the post 21st century. I cannot see the countries that are in the ALBA, in the Dawn group, that are going to be willing to experiment that. Now, within the countries that are within the ALTE, the ALBA, what we need to question is whether the leadership of Hugo Chavez can be substituted. Now we have there two people, President Morales and President Correa. Now, does President Correa has the characteristics to succeed President Chavez? There were replies yes, but I believe that in terms of the weight of the country, it's a no. And the same happens with Bolivia. The, it Venezuela situation, what Venezuela represented was not only Chavez, but its own weight as an economy. We have many Caribbean countries that depend fundamentally of oil, and neither Bolivia nor Ecuador can do this. So the rhetoric came tied with the petrodollars that President Chavez had at his disposal, which is a differentiating factor for as a possibility to project himself beyond the discourse. It is clear that the leadership of President Correa or President Morales have some elements that I cannot share necessarily within the full exercise of the democracy. And this has to be taken into account within a full democratic exercise. We could think that President Morales or Correa can manipulate the vote. The answer is no. They do answer in a legitimate way, but I'm going to go along with the other parts and they come along with some elements that allow them to place themselves where they are. So there is not a management in the classic sense of democracy where there is a free play of ideas, whether there are different conditions and facilities for the different parties. The government uses everything to its favor. There are many restrictions that have nothing to do with what we understand as a logical manner, as a defense for the democratic values, and it's called the freedom of expression. So, in that way, there is a way to convince the public that what is being done is what is correct. So, from that standpoint, I don't think it is true that Correa has the strength or the weight, and the same thing happens with Bolivia. The next question was very important, and I haven't touched upon it, and I should have. One of the most significant contributions in this Latin American process is the search for the end of discrimination and racism and the incorporation, inclusion of the indigenous people within the process in Latin America. This was not invented by the governments of the last 10 years. This has been a historical process. Countries, especially the Andean countries, which have a high Indian population, have tried to develop in the last 30 to 40 years. In this context, President Morales reaching presidency is very important. It is unquestionable that a country that has more than 40% of Indian population, in reality, it took too long for that to be accomplished. It took us almost 200 years to have an Indian president. That's a shame. No, the fact that he's Indian and he's also president has generated a vision of the Indians about themselves that have changed things. We have ministries, we have heads of state that are coming from the Indian ethnicity that really represent the makeup of the country. And that strengthens the affirmation of the role that some of the citizens have to be, and that they should always be considered first class citizens, but they were considered second or third class citizens. This is valid for Bolivia, and it's being lived upon in most of the countries in Latin America. So we're dealing with the multiculturalism and plurilinguistic scenarios that has to be taken into account and assume that it enriches and not impoverishes the country. This is an advantage, not a disadvantage, and that has to be really supported and it has to be promoted. Similar process is the one that is faced by the United States. We're looking in particular to the growth of the Latin American population in the country. It is fundamental, I think. My impression is that you have to look very deeply the Equatorian and Bolivian constitutions that have already integrated these concepts in a very profound manner, and it has to look with the search of a transformation of the way we look at the classic democracy with unquestionable values, but that can be transformed. And to finalize, the issue of the vouchers, you need to understand the vouchers in two dimensions, a positive one and a negative one. Regarding cost benefit, I think it's most positive than negative. The voucher, you have to underline that it's a direct transfer of money to the people, but it is a transfer that is conditioned to a response. And I'm not going to repeat that again. I'm not just going to give you 20, 50, or $80 per month just because. I will give it to you in exchange for you giving me something. And the experience of the vouchers, and let me insist that has been done in Mexico and Brazil and Bolivia. So it really doesn't matter if they are from the center, left, or right, they have generated positive results. They have helped expressly to improve the conditions of health, education, and reduce the poverty. If the vouchers were the only mechanism, they would not work adequately. Together with the vouchers, that they accelerate the processes, you need to really do structural social investment in health, in education, in rural electricity infrastructure, in a reduction of mobility and morbidity rates through training of teachers. So the vouchers alone, they are not enough. The vouchers, together with health policies and education policies that complement them, are necessary. The negative element, and this is unavoidable, it is a way of populism or clientelism. It is not the state the one that gives you; it's the president or the government who gives me the voucher, and that is used politically in a way that is generates interests. There are costs that we need to ask ourselves if it is worth paying. It is not ideal, but in reality, the result in the fight against poverty in Latin America has been interesting enough for us to accept, despite all this political effect, that the vouchers have been useful. And a brief remark is that the neoliberal characterization today, I would not make it so harshly. Peru and Mexico don't face the radical neoliberalism of the decade of the 90s. They have chosen the way of an open economy, but they also are sensitive towards social investment that 20 years ago was not there. And this is a process of transformation that is interesting in Latin America. And I think that even in the economies that are most open, they're much less orthodox than those same countries in the decade of the 90s. Okay, now we're done with the time, but I would like to thank you once more to President Mesa for a very instructive and profound characterization of the Latin American reality. We're very proud of your visit and thank you for having me here. Thank you very much.
Si if you can return the headsets back to the table, please, once you're done.